everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm excited to discuss today's webinar on marketing and building pipeline with a technical buyer. Very excited to also be joined today by Carolyn King and Ryan McCurdy. Carolyn is the head of pipeline marketing at Chronosphere, and she recently led marketing at Calyptia and Stream Native. Ryan is the SVP of demand gen at Astronomer, and he was the head of marketing at Laceworks and Bolster. So thank you all for joining. Carolyn, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to start with a high-level question. How do technical buyers like to buy?
Great question for us to get started. I think that one of the things that's very top of mind is that technical buyers want to learn at their own pace. They don't want to be sold to. So what we focus on a lot is really understanding what type of content, what type of events, whether that's webinars, hands-on labs, etc. How are we building that out and really giving that to them so that if they are looking to engage through a technical blog, that's there for them. If it's something where they do want that hands-on instructor-led training. So it's a bit of just thinking through what those different channels are and different assets and making sure that that's easily available.
And Ryan, what are some of the unique challenges that you faced with technical buyers compared to other audiences that you've marketed to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest one that I've encountered, and I think, founders encounter a lot of times too, is technical buyers they can easily tell if like what you're talking about. So if your content isn't authentic, if it's not technical enough, if you're missing like the key like jargon pieces, it's probably not going to hit. They're probably not going to believe you. And they will go elsewhere. And that problem is actually typically compounded by how close these communities are. So you have to be really, really thoughtful about what you put out there and the authenticity and the accuracy of it for technical buyers specifically. It's just like the marketing, I guess, fluff, so to speak, like just doesn't hit, and it actually does you a pretty big disservice. So, especially with things like ChatGPT kind of coming onto the scene, it's like to a certain point, it can become overused. And if you're not careful, you're going to do a disservice to your brand and what you're talking about.
And when you think about building out content for these buyers and being authentic, like where do you start and how do you think through that content? How do you not fall down that slippery slope of just kind of building out the generic marketing fluff, so to speak? Carolyn,
Yeah.
or Brian, why don't you start and we'll kick it over to Carolyn.
Sure. So, I mean, at least at a more of a startup or, a hyper growth company, the founders are usually pretty hands-on, and you usually have a bunch of great technical people. And, getting them out there, getting them talking about it, getting them to write, content is king. And in my opinion, it takes a village typically to get these things. So if you can get all your technical people having some sort of cadence of writing and, having a cadence of content production, you're in a really good place. And if those people are your founders, which everyone wants to hear anyways, I think it puts you in a great position to go create that authentic content. Give you an example, I shouldn't be the one probably writing a white paper on like data orchestration, for example. I can go summarize a lot of that, and I can go up level it so when everyone understands it, make sure we're communicating the benefits to various buyers. But that's going to be best written by one of our SMEs probably, who has lived that pain ideally previously.
Carolyn, what do you think on how you build out that content, and how do you even get those team members to write? Because sometimes that's a skill in and of itself that a lot of engineers, founders themselves don't necessarily have.
Yeah, no, this is definitely a challenge. I think one thing that was interesting when I joined Stream Native, we were really early, and so most of the team was engineers. And so that it was so organic that we would really lean in and rely on those engineers to create content. But I think because we established that as part of the company culture early, we were really able to continue with that. When I joined Calyptia at our first all hands, I announced that we had a new community team. And then the next slide was, welcome, you are all a part of that community team. And so that was the way of really kind of introducing that idea that content doesn't just come from marketing, that really everybody in the company is going to contribute to that. And so I think, I'm very, very much what Ryan said. Even though I'm a marketer, I'm generally biased against having marketers create content for a technical audience. And so I think about it that the marketers are really listening to the market, understanding what topics, how we're going to build out these different campaigns, and then bringing in the right thought leaders to actually put on the webinar or to write. I think on the writing front in particular, it's a very strong partnership. I will work very hands-on with developers so that they can contribute the technical expertise, and me or someone on my team can help bring the polish and whatnot we need. The CTAs that are necessary, make sure we're targeting the right audience, things like that.
And then how do you ensure that the content and have that relationship with, let's say there is an engineer that loves writing and sometimes potentially writes a little too much. Do you put those boundaries or those guardrails in early of what they can talk about and what they shouldn't?
So this has happened. It's not that common, and there's actually not too many complaints on engineers wanting to contribute. I'd hope that would be a problem. I'd have more, but I think one thing that's been helpful is to get them to come in early. So we say, hey, before you go and write the blog post, let's have a conversation. And in that conversation, you can start to align and make sure that the content is targeted in the right way. So as an example, sitting down and saying, okay, who's the audience for this? What do we want the takeaway for this to be for that audience? Like, what types of actions are we hoping to drive? Very, very simple questions, but questions that people skip, and then they spend a ton of time writing, and it's really just not on track. So I think really encouraging the team to look at marketing as a partner and to come to us very early so we can start to have these conversations and build together is really important.
Ryan, do you believe that more content is better in this case with this audience, or do you look at your engineering team, your founders, and anyone who's willing to write, try to put a piece together, or is it much more selective?
Yeah, Carolyn kind of hit it on the head. It's like, this is a great problem to have if you have it. There's never enough. At least in my opinion, I've never ran into having too much content. I think where, you kind of have to interject a little bit is, well, how are you structuring the content? Not all content is very helpful. Like, I'll still take it, and there's probably some place I can use it, but like, then typically, we're talking like usually in like startups, hypergrowth, teams are pretty small. So like, you want everything to be meaningful. So there's no random acts of content. And if you can start having somewhat of a roadmap, just like you would in product for content that maps to SEO, what I found is you can be a little bit more proactive about this and just give like your engineers and the other subject matter experts in your company almost a list to choose from. And we've done this to really map out like our next, just let's call it year or 2 year SEO and kind of like content strategy. We grow a lot through inbound. And we have that list, and we have templates that we want people to work off of. So like, we know like when they write something, it's a certain length, certain things are called out. So it's a little bit more plug and play. But that said, even if you don't have that, I'll take the content, and things like ChatGPT can help in this regard. Like, it's great for structuring content or maybe pivoting it a little bit. So that's my take.
And how do you ensure that marketing message and those ideas that you're putting out? How do you ensure that it resonates with the engineers or technical talent that you're trying to sell to? Carolyn, do you want to start?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this builds a bit on what Ryan was just talking about as well. It's that idea, and I think it's an important point of clarification. It's not just about going to your engineering team and saying, hey guys, start writing some blog posts. It's much more strategic and structured on the marketing side. So as Ryan said, putting parameters, like we as a marketing org typically decide what those topics are. And then we go and talk to we see who our resources are and like who's best equipped to help contribute on this. And then that person does it. So there is a lot of structure behind the scenes. I would say to the question of how do we know that this is resonating or that we're building content that resonates? I think this is like the hardest thing to do because especially with there being so much content out there, in my experience, we focus a lot on what we're hearing in sales calls, what we're hearing at meetups, what we're hearing when we're doing discovery calls with open source users. And so there's not a lot of like, oh, I think this is a good idea. We should go build it. I've heard this on 5 or 6 calls now. Maybe we should go do a blog post on it. And so it's pretty informed by the time we get there. So it's not such a risky bet to take, I would say. And we don't always hit it spot on, but I'd say, we recently did a deep dive on the customer journey for an account we just closed. And it was really interesting to see what deep engagement they had throughout the sales funnel in webinars and technical content. And so looking back on things like that, we can actually go back and measure and say, okay, what content is helping to drive sales? And yeah, it's a learning process for sure though.
Yeah.
And
Just to add onto that just real quick, I think one of the things is how you track engagement and just the KPIs like component of this. There's absolutely like I think the proactive piece of like, all right, I'm hearing these things, we should go create content around them and then go test. And I think the testing, like you can see how many people have visited this blog or this page. And then as a secondary step, through UTMs or whatever else, in your calls to action, you can say, okay, well, did someone jump from this blog into a demo or into our self-service or trial or into a webinar? So like what was kind of that next step in their path to converting? And this is really when we start looking at like, well, how much pipeline is this topic driving? And that sometimes then we'll build the case like, should we build another go-to-market theme? Or should we put more investment in this topic? And I find like, that's a great mature motion to start running down from a demand gen point of view.
so you both have a lot of expertise in open source products as well, which is unique. And having tried to recruit people in this space, it really is unique for a marketer. I'd love kind of tips in your general playbook on how you think about project adoption to product sales and that process. Like, Calyptia, for instance, had an incredible, open source product early on. I know when you joined, Carolyn, and then how did you think about taking that and turning it into actual sales?
Yeah. I think it's different for every open source and what that relationship is to the commercial product. And I also think it depends where you're at in the stage of the business, but the like early steps are like, let's go and learn about the community. So very early on, my first like month at Calyptia, we launched the FluentBit newsletter. And we said, this is going to be an entire newsletter that's dedicated to Fluent news. And again, nothing like shocking or, crazy to think about, but a lot of people don't think about these things. Like prior to that, the blogs had been very much focused on Calyptia core and not on FluentBit. And so when you have that focus on the commercial product and you are not building to support the community, you're leaving a lot on the table. So we said, okay, let's start to build a foundation to support the community, to drive engagement, have there be a place. We built Fluentbit Academy where we would house all of our on-demand webinars and whatnot. So really starting to build that foundation so the community knows that that they're supported, that if they do want to go and adopt, that there will be trainings that will help ensure that they're successful, that there are thought leaders and whatnot, that if they have questions, they can come to us. We can kind of help support them in that open source journey. So I think that that is like step one, is definitely making sure that you're building that relationship, and that that there is no selling happening there, that it's pure, we're here to support you. We're super passionate about Fluentbit. You're super passionate about Fluentbit. Like, how can we do stuff together, whether it's a meetup or whatnot, to drive more awareness, engagement, sharing of best practices, et cetera. And I think that for us, and this is actually very similar to Apache Pulsar and Stream Native, once you start to build that, there's going to be some segment of that population that doesn't want to do the open source. They want that commercial offering. And so I think that if you can build that trusted relationship on the open source side, you'll get people to start to raise their hands and say, oh, wait, what's that other stuff that Calyptia is doing, the built-in, that we don't need to build it ourselves? And so not to make it sound like too rosy of a picture, but I that's what we did at Calyptia, and it was very powerful in driving demand gen.
Ryan, I'd love to hear from your perspective. Like, how do you think about that playbook and that transition?
Yeah, it's actually, pretty tough. The company I'm at, Astronomer, we don't own the project, which presents a different challenge, right? So we help drive the project. We're, we're definitely the commercial stewards of the project. We're part of every release, but Apache owns it. And then Apache has its own board, and all the PMC members really drive the project, which I think half of are part of Astronomer. But what it really comes down to, I believe, is being able to clearly and distinctly draw a line between, well, what's open source and what's the product, or what's the commercial offering. We've taken a lot of steps at Astronomer over the last year to clearly show and articulate that. Because if they blend together, you're going to get the question is like, well, why do we need you? And this is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about as our buyers progress with us. How are we going to keep creating value past the open source offering, and what's open source, and what's Astro for us. And we've done an incredible job of that. And we saw just a ton of growth this last year. So when you think about that, and you have a really clear line, you really are able to go talk about what should we go educate the open source community on, and then what's the nurture path to becoming an enterprise adopter of our product. And we've developed a couple of really core themes that we market, where we have a strong handoff between DevRel and community and demand gen marketing. We're all in the same organization, actually. So we've spent a bunch of time thinking through, hey, what are the things we should be educating the community on that is a natural path to come talk to us.
So from a branding perspective, if it was all up to you, in the case of if you have a open source project and you're building a company, a commercial company alongside it, what do you think it should be branded something similar, or do you think it should be branded something completely different? Should there be any parallels? Carolyn, do you want to start?
If I could choose it, I would have there be like strong consistency across both. I think it is definitely an added challenge, because essentially you're building two distinct brands. So in my previous life, it was Apache Pulsar and Stream Native. Like, those are there's no inherent connection between those, and even with Calyptia and with Fluentbit, And so what happens is that when they are so like separate, you have to spend a lot of time connecting the dots for your audience so that they know, there's a lot of like, when I joined Cliptia, our first KubeCon, my first KubeCon with them was what's Cliptia? I don't know. Oh, do you know FluentBit? Yeah, I know FluentBit. So it's like, how do you close that gap? And we can talk more about that. But yeah, I would love to go into if I had the chance now, I would brand alongside.
Yeah, I thought that would be the case, but definitely wanted to lean on you guys as experts on that. Again, from kind of the marketing lens, what advice would you give a founder who is thinking about building an open source community or building an open source product or starting with an open source product? Was there any specific advice that you would give them before as they're getting started? Ryan, I'll kick it to you.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is who am I building this for? And really having a good understanding of the accounts that will either adopt the open source project and or the accounts you should be selling into. So it's like, what is your account-based approach? And then of course, taking that further, who in those accounts will care at the persona level? I think the best companies in the world do that. Because if you don't do that, it's hard to get everyone really focused. And then you're selling to everyone, or now everybody's the buyer. So I think if you really understand the accounts you should go focus on and having some form of an account-based strategy, that puts you in a great position to win.
Carolyn, any suggestions for you for founders as they start thinking about these different paths?
I think, it's interesting to think about launching a company alongside an open source project. Like, I think that the timeline for open source to grow, typically there's an incubation period that a lot of commercial companies aren't afforded. So I would definitely think about that. I think the timeline is just typically longer for the scale and adoption for an open source. I would say if I'm thinking about launching an open source very early, I would be thinking probably not exactly what Ryan said, but kind of along the same lines is like, who are those like massive companies that will be not even massive, but who are those big markets that will be engaging? Because the biggest thing you need is contributors in the early days. And so if there's not, if you haven't identified who those people are that will come in and help you build this, it's going to be pretty challenging.
So I want to shift a little bit and talk about teams internally, and collaboration between marketing and product development is really crucial in targeting the technical buyer. How do you foster effective communication, whether you're managing up, managing over, or managing two product managers? How do you think about this relationship, and how do you foster an environment where you can have those feedback loops? Ryan, do you want to start?
Sure. I think the most clear way to do it is through some form of KPIs. To give you an example, we have a sales-led motion at Astronomer, and then also a product-led motion at Astronomer. So we have to work really closely with the product team to get our self-service or trial to where we want it. And I think in order to do that, if we're not aligned on the KPIs, specifically growth, engagement, activation, MRR, for example, it's like you're always probably going to butt heads. So it really starts there. Like, what are the KPIs we need to agree to, and then building, I would say, just a plan together on what can we deliver that will help us accomplish that.
Is that something that you like to build from the top down, or is there anything unique in there that you like to point out for building out your KPIs?
Yeah, I think we've launched our product-led motion the middle of last year. So, we had to go start from scratch. Like, well, what does great look like? Of course, when we launched it, there's just a ton of learnings, and there's learnings all the time. So, we have a couple really big KPIs that we track to. Signups, once people sign up, are they actually activating and or doing something? And then at the end of our self-service, you can put in a credit card. And then from there, are you consuming? And those are the three or four KPIs that we really try and track to. And, we're always talking about what features can we implement to help consumption? How can we make things easier? Should we have multiple paths people can go down? So for example, for us, we have a lot of people come to us as the, stewards of Apache Airflow, which is huge. I think there's 30 million downloads a month. We have a lot of people who want to adopt Apache Airflow. And then we have a lot of people who are already using Airflow who want to buy Astro. Those are very different maturity curves. So to go build out a couple of paths like that, from a product perspective, it's pretty difficult. From a marketing perspective, well, all right, there's different nurture things that we've been doing for a long time that isn't new. So it's really working together on some of those mechanics to get it right.
Carolyn, so in your experience in working both with product, and you've done early stage where head of product is also founder, how do you think about managing that relationship and working together and building out that feedback loop?
Yeah, I'm smiling as this question's being asked because my product people have been my founders at my last two companies. And so very much that relationship with product is the same as the relationship with the founder, who is often also the head of sales or my sales guy, or girl to start with. I think in the early days, and I would say, the early days being less than 50 employees, the feedback piece is actually not that difficult because the team is small, right? But that's taking a lot of things that's making a lot of assumptions. So I'll say, to be more specific for founders on the call that are thinking about this, how are you capturing learnings on a weekly basis and communicating those? And a lot of that in the early days is coming from sales calls. And so for me, product, of course, is super important, but the feedback in the early stages, that feedback's coming from the market. It's not coming from, product people have ideas, marketing people have ideas, but the customer's telling you what the path is. So I think being very tapped into what we're hearing from sales, what are those learnings? What are we hearing from customers on calls? And how are we sharing that across product and marketing? That's the biggest piece.
So going back to tactics, what are some things that you guys have done either in marketing an open source project or marketing your commercial product? What are some tactics that you have done that have been possibly unique to this technical buyer, or is the flow similar to a traditional SaaS company that's selling into the business team? Ryan, you want to start?
Sure. So it's a great question. I think at somewhat of a basic level, it does all come back to content, how authentic that content is, and creating a path for people, to learn about the problem, educate them, learn about why they should think about you, and ultimately have some form of mechanism to get their hands on the product. And tactically, that last step is really critical. And how do you get people? How do you enable people to get their hands on the product, and how is that effectively done? I think one of the things I've ran in the past is a little cliche, but a Pepsi challenge, if we all remember that from many, many years ago, which is a speed or skill test. For us, we find they're either using the open source project already, maybe they're using one of the cloud native tools out there for orchestration, and we want to kind of put our money where our mouth is. And for a technical buyer, that's great, because of what it actually acts like is a POC. So you can actually accelerate sales cycles sometimes by doing some type of speed or skill test where you're comparing their product versus ours. Now, if they're not using anything, that's very different. That probably is best for not for a product led motion, but for a sales led motion, those kind of like Pepsi challenges, as I call them, I found have worked really well, and you can do those virtually in field events. Um, so I found those to be like pretty effective. It takes a little bit to get those things set up, but um, when you can really start showing how you're different and the benefits and potentially like ROI, technical buyers want that stuff too. They don't just want feature function. So I found that to be really effective.
Carolyn, I know you've done also a lot of in-person tactics over the last few years. So is there anything there specifically, any advice you give for how a team should think about approaching this?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and this is like a interesting question, because there was how we did things during quarantine, and then after quarantine was like the world just opened up, and there was so much more to do there. I think there's different opportunities. Obviously things like technical meetups are great if you're trying to connect with developers. I think two things that we've done in my past life, and some things we're thinking about doing right now, that served very different purposes. So I'll give you the first example is doing a open source focused meetup. So we did the Pulsar Summit every year, and that was great because it was an opportunity not just to bring all of the different users together and to get them sharing best practices and connecting, but it also shows people who have not adopted Pulsar that who's using it, how they're using it, et cetera. So it's kind of like marketing and promotion for the open source project, which I think is very impactful. And I know we were talking about this before hopping on live, but choosing the city to do that in is really important. So we did our first in-person in San Francisco. And so we also focused on all of the speakers were Apache Pulsar users, but we reached out to the broader tech community. So we were bringing in all of the big names in tech you can think of from the Bay Area and getting them in attendance. So I did just like the opening keynote and said, who here uses Pulsar, or who here, people raise their hand, who here is this new to? 70% of people it was new to. So it was like this like magic balance of, for the users, like they're now super excited, they're meeting other people using it, et cetera. But it was also a huge event for us to do like that net new audience. So that's like one thing I like to think about, because it serves very different purposes. Another event that we did was we were working with a company that was a massive user of Apache Pulsar. And so we said, okay, we're going to come on site and do a training. And in a one-day training, it's a very big company. There was like 99 engineers attended that. So something like that is like very impactful in ensuring that they're going to continue to use Pulsar, and also that their adoption of Pulsar will spread across the company. So again, one is like very technical, like how do we drive deeper adoption within this very specific account? On the other side, it's like much more broad, like how are we driving net new awareness?
So now I want to shift it to advice for founders. So a lot of founders, especially early stage founders that we work with, don't even at the seed stage, don't even have a marketing team or a marketing person yet. So what advice would you give them for starting to think about pipeline? You two are both demand gen experts. How should a founder start to think about building pipeline in those early days? Carolyn, you want to start?
And like early days, make sure that like build from the bottom up, right? Make sure you're capturing people who are interested when they're coming to the site. So this isn't very hard stuff to do, but develop CTAs, get people into your newsletter. That's where things like events, a lot of people are not going to come to your website and sign up for your newsletter. But if you're doing an event and you can like get them into the funnel. So I would say early days, make sure that you're like bringing people like very top of funnel, but then you're able to like convert somehow. So get that email, get that contact information, and start to build from there. But I think the other thing, and Ryan hit on this earlier, is like test different content and events. If it's early, a lot of companies end up pivoting. So maybe you think it's this thing that they're coming to you for, and you learn through conversations that it's something else. Testing different content and events is going to be super helpful in getting you there more quickly.
And then on that event topic, before I pass it over to Ryan with the same question, what draws people in, especially with this technical buyer? Like, what do they, let's take it from an early stage company.
Yeah.
What's the carrot to get these engineers there?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I've had a lot of success in doing is identifying a couple specific use cases and then building for that. And the difference is, and I'll give you the example from Stream Native, you can do like an Apache Pulsar 101, and that's really great for people that are already using Apache Pulsar and are already interested. One of the early learnings that we had is that people who are moving to microservices were much more likely to be interested in Pulsar. So we built a 3-part series on developing and building microservices. And so that was a really, really successful campaign for us because number one, it's thought leadership. Number two, it's like highly educational. There's a value add for whoever's attending that event. And it wasn't just about Pulsar Stream Native. It was the educational value that was being provided was much broader than that. So for us, that's like a great way. You might not always know what those use cases are, but again, when we talk about testing, you probably have some good instincts from your sales conversations and whatnot, and then put that content out there. And that's a really great way, especially if it's use case focused. You're not trying to sell them anything. You're trying to like connect them to experts who can help bring value as they're looking to build out this initiative.
And Ryan, for you, what advice would you give founders that are early stage and don't have a marketer to lean on, but need to start thinking about building demand?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we could spend a whole session just talking about this one topic, in my opinion. Like, there's potentially a lot, but I like to kind of break it down into maybe like 3 steps. That first step, I would really go identify your ICP. Those are my 3 favorite letters: ideal customer profile, and specifically, what are the accounts who are going to care the most, or what accounts have the most pain that we can go solve. You can map those out through different tools, but that's a thing that like is a lot of times a North Star for a marketer or go to market specifically. In fact, that's how a lot of like, the best go to market teams that I've worked on really come together and execute, is having a great ICP. And once you have that, and maybe even before you have that, and Carolyn, you touched on this, is like, well, there's the content aspect of it and having calls to action. And I think if you can really marry those two, like forming somewhat of a content engine as a founder, either through yourself, your co-founders, the other subject matter experts you have on staff, you just agree, hey, we're going to go write this many things. We're going to have calls to action as a next step and all those things. Like, that's what you got to marry, the content production with the calls to action to maybe a webinar, maybe it's a meetup. Like, what is the next step? Like, you can't forget that, or you're never going to capture them. And, that's how you build up your database. And databases are like gold mines. Like, that's what you go nurture and convert. So you gotta build that up. Like those are probably, I would say, like, kind of the big two. And then from there, it's just really having what I would call just like an experimentation mindset. So how are you testing? How are you analyzing? What should we go try next? And what's going to happen is you're going to find this builds pipeline or this doesn't. This is our buyer, or it's actually this other group. And then you're going to go, I think, from there, figure out some of the really, you're going to really figure out some of the hard problems.
Fantastic. So final question, a quick one, if you can answer it quickly, but what is one thing you wish founders knew about marketing? Carolyn?
Man. Um, Ryan, do you have this one? Like,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
gotta think about it for a
I
second. It's like so many things.
you're right, there is. And I think there's two. And you're right, there's a lot of things actually, but I think the two big ones, content is king. And in order to like have any like one blog or one page like isn't content. I'm talking about like a content engine that is like being maintained. That takes a village. It's not just the one marketing person you hire, which I've had to be that person before. Like, no, it like takes a lot of people to go do that at a really high level, and there has to be like it has to be managed and KPIs against it. Um, and sometimes, like it's just what people are paid on. Sometimes, like it's part of like how we comp them. I think that's a really big thing that founders should try and learn more about. And I think the other thing is a lot of times when I've joined earlier stage companies, it's all feature function. We created this, it does this. It's hard to really extract any value or benefit. Um, it's just not spelled out. So I'd really think through like, okay, we created this, it does this, which helps you accomplish X, Y, and Z, or helps your company accomplish X, Y, and Z. You can't forget that the value, you can't forget the benefit. So content and like that, kind of the value-based messaging going hand in hand. So those are the things that I would say. There's a bunch of other things with like investment and headcount, and this could be a whole nother topic.
Yeah. All
We'll
right.
save that for another day.
I'll do two real quick. Thanks, Ryan. I needed a minute to make it concise. So I would say the first thing is don't get overwhelmed by marketing. There's many different aspects of marketing. You don't need to do everything. So in the early days, focus on what's most impactful. Like if you start with a blog and then you build in the next thing and then you build in, like you don't need to do paid out of the gate. You don't need to think about this controversial SEO out of the gate. Like you don't need to do all of the things. Like start, like crawl, walk, run would be the first part. And then the second thing very much in terms of what Ryan just said, a little bit different, but that idea, if you're talking about like features that you're building, et cetera, you're talking about you. And I'll see this like, it'll be like one of the first things I do if somebody's like, what do you think about our marketing? You go to their blogs. If every blog is about me, like my company, something's wrong because people aren't coming to know about you. Technical buyers are coming to learn how you are going to help them solve their problem. So you see it, it's like very, very interesting for companies that are doing it right with technical audiences. It's the value add on the problem for them. So it's like about you. If you go and you're writing about me, about us, about our features, there's going to be a huge disconnect right off the bat.
That is a great point to end on. And I believe that in all elements of marketing, that when you're building this content, you can't just be hard selling the entire time. You have to be thinking about providing value. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining. Carolyn and Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time. Please check out sierraventures.com/ascend is more of our founder and portfolio content. And we'll have a blog post up next week with this and the video if you want to share it. Thanks so much and have a great weekend.
Thanks, you guys. Great
Thanks.
to talk to you.
Bye.